Hi folks, welcome to another installment of the PineScript Lab series. In trading, it is not uncommon for gaps to occur, and they can be used as signals or targets depending on the price action. So today, we're going to develop a tracking system for intraday gaps, gaps that occur within the regular hours of a trading session. Let's now move over to TradingView and dive in. We'll start with a blank script. And we'll now begin with defining some helper functions for our indicator. First, a function to evaluate a gap. A gap means that the previous bar close is higher or lower than the current bar open. So close 1 for previous close minus open for current open. And we'll make sure that we round our prices to the symbol's minimum tick to avoid false positives. So pass dot round to in tick for close one, and the same for open. That's round to min tick for open. And next, a function to identify a gap fill, meaning that the price has reached again the close value of the gap. So for this, we'll define a function with an argument that will be our target, and our target should be between the low and the high value of the current bar. So target to be less or equal to the high, and target to be more or equal to the low. And then for consistency, we'll use the round to min tick function in order to keep our price rounded, like so. All right, so let's do that for target. There, and there for the low of the price. And that should be it. Let's save. No errors. Good. We'll now define a type that will hold values for our gap, like so. So type gap with a Boolean value up that will identify if our gap is up or down, a float value for the delta between the close and the open of the gap, the target that will be our close value for the gap, the run that will be the price movement since the gap, the line that will be drawn to be at the level of the target, and finally, the bar count that will initialize to 0, that will count the number of bars that have elapsed since the gap. And that's it. Then we declare an array to store our open gaps, like so. Let's save. No errors. Good to continue. Since we're tracking intraday gaps, we have to reset open gaps at the start of day or post-market if extended hours are enabled. So if session dot is first bar or session is post-market, in that case, our open gaps will be reset to an empty array dot new with the type gap and parentheses to call the new function. Let's save. No errors, good to go. Now we're ready to identify intraday gaps. Let's first add some base conditions. So the first one will be that the path date is confirmed. Then the second one will be that the session is in market, so is market. Because we only want gaps occurring within the day, we also don't want to try identifying a gap on the first regular bar. So, and not session dot is first bar regular. Now we can call our helper function to evaluate a potential gap. So delta equal at evaluate gap, and then if delta is different from 0, that means that we have a gap. So in that case, we create a new gap dot new, and then our gap dot up will be equal to delta being more than 0. Our gap dot delta will be equal to the absolute value of our delta that has been evaluated. So pass dot apt delta. Our gap target will be equal at the map dot round to mid tick again of our close of the previous bar. So close 1. And then we can push that new gap into the open gaps array. Open dot gaps dot push gap, like so. And lastly, we can add the line to visualize our gap target level, like so. So if gap up, we'll have our gap level being a new line from previous bar to current bar, being at the gap target level with a width of 2 and a color green. And for gap down, so in that case, the only difference is the fact that we'll use the color red. Let's save, add to chart, and check it out. We can see that a lot of gaps are being identified. Here, here, here. So let's pay close attention to the open and close values to validate a few. So for example, for that gap, the open is 521.41. The close of the previous one is 521.42. So indeed, there is a gap. Let's check one other, for example, that one. So the open is 521.75, and the previous one, the close, is 521.79. Indeed, this is another gap. Looks good. Awesome. As per our test, a lot of gaps are being identified. So it would be interesting to reduce the number of gaps identified. For instance, we could not include gaps that are filled immediately. Let's first add an input for this, like so. So a Boolean input named withInstantFill with a default value of false and a title include instant gap fill. Then in our evaluate gap function, we'll take it into account. So first we'll need a variable delta equal at our gap delta, and if our delta is more than 0, and in fact it should be the absolute value since it could be positive or negative. And then in that case, if not with instant fill and is gap filled for close 1, that is our target, in that case, we just reset the delta to 0. And of course, at the end of our function, we need to make sure to return delta. That should be it. Let's save and check again. At first glance, we can see that there are much less gaps being identified. Let's mark them. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 gaps identified. So now let's turn on the inclusion of immediate fields. And as you can see, there are way more. There. So the feature is working well. Awesome, excellent. Now we can iterate through the open gaps to identify fields. So if our open gaps size of array is more than 0, that means that we have open gaps. In that case, for I equal 0 to open gaps dot size -1, since our index is starting from 0, we get the gap at that index. So gap equal at open gaps dot get I. First, we extend our gap level line to the current bar, like so. If our bar count is different from 0, we set the x2 to the current bar index. Then we update our gap run value, like so. So if our gap is up and either the low is less than the low of the previous bar, or the bar count is 0, in that case, our run should be equal to the gap target minus the rounded value of our low. And for the gap down, so not gap up, we'll use the high. And finally, we identify if the gap is filled or not. So if is gap filled for the gap target, in that case, we remove it from the open gaps. So open gaps dot remove at index I. Else, we update the bar count of 1 and we update the open gaps at that index. So set I with the new gap values. However, we have to be careful here. Since we are changing the array by removing some of its elements, we need to make sure that the index is still relevant. So for that, we need an offset. So let's declare an offset that will be initialized to 0. And our index should be equal to I minus the offset. And now to get our gap, we should use index. And when we remove an element, we increase the offset by 1. So offset plus equal 1. And of course, here we need to use index instead of I. And also here, anytime we are calling a function that requires an index on open gaps in this situation. Let's save and check again on the chart. We can see that our gap lines are correctly extended until the gap is filled. For example, here, the gap has been identified correctly, and then until the gap is filled, the line is getting extended. Awesome, that works well. Let's also include some alerts. When a gap is identified, alert gap up at the gap target, and for gap down, same thing, but we're just going to change gap up to gap down. And when a gap is filled, here, like so, gap filled at the gap target on the bar number, bar count, which is the number of bars that have elapsed since the identification of the gap. Let's say, no errors, great. We are now ready to move to our final feature that will display statistics on intraday gaps. So first, let's define a function to initialize our statistics table, like so. Then we can declare and initialize the statistics table by calling the sets.table function and assigning it to a variable, like so. Let's save and check on the chart. Looks good. Awesome. Let's now declare the persistent variables to use for statistics, like so. Our total gap will increase by 1 every time we identify a gap. So when the delta is different of 0, we make sure that we add 1 to the total gap. And our total delta will increase by the identified gap delta. So total delta plus equal gap.delta. And our fill variables will be updated every time we fill a gap. Here, like so. The last step is to update the relevant cells of our statistics table after identifying gaps and fills, like so. We use total gap for total gaps. We use total delta divided by total gap to get the average gap. We use total filled divided by total gap to get the percentage of filled gaps. We use total fill bar count divided by total filled to get the fill average bar. And finally, we use total fill run divided by total filled to get the fill average run. Let's save and check the result. Our table is now displaying some interesting statistics. Out of 845 gaps identified, we've got an average gap of 2 cents, a fill gap within the day of more than 90%, a fill average bar of 40, and a fill average run of 47 cents. It looks great. I think we did it again. Awesome. I hope you enjoyed learning how to track intraday gaps with PineScript. You can use this indicator to add this additional layer of information to your strategies. I have included a link in the description below. Remember, trading is a journey, and mastering PineScript is just one step along the way. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, please feel free to leave a comment. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.